be with you here today. My work at the Department for International Relations and Cooperation at DERCO is in charge of the Levant. So that's Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, unfortunately most of the places that are being bombed by Israel. And that has continued. So I think I would like to start out by saying my remarks to you today are about South Africa's stand for justice in Gaza and the new global paradigm shift. So I would like to say that South Africa has always stood with Gaza, but this is long before October 7th. As most of us in the room would know, that this is now the 18th year of siege that Gaza is going through. And that siege started in 2007, the year after after Hamas had won the elections. And I was actually part of the South African election observer mission to Palestine in 2006. I was deployed to a place called Kalkilia, which is a town in the West Bank. And I'm just giving, a bit of a colorful anecdote here, because that town, the Israelis had built a wall around Kalkilia, and the people of that town could not enter or exit unless the Israeli occupation forces allowed it. They were dispossessed of their farmland, which was around Kalkilia, and they were even being denied water resources. So it was like a town that was imprisoned by a wall. And I didn't think at that time that things could ever get worse than that. And unfortunately they did. And despite the fact that South Africa's observer mission said that those elections were free and fair, that Hamas had won them free and fairly, they were never permitted to govern. That was really a violation of the whole notion of democracy, that the people who get the most votes would be able to govern, but they were denied that opportunity, and we know the rest is history. So I also want to say that South Africa's, particularly the ruling ANC, support for Palestine is obviously being far greater than even 1994. So we all know, sitting in this room, that we have been watching 70 years of apartheid, ethnic cleansing, the use of violence and demographic engineering in Palestine. What we see today in Gaza is just a culmination of the worst of humanity, that worse than we could have ever imagined. So I've been to the occupied territories 4 times since the first time was in the year 2001, and I joined a multi-party parliamentary delegation. And even then, I didn't think that we could get worse than what we were seeing then. And it is today so much worse, as Haider and many of you will understand. At the UN opening of the UN General Assembly, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that now Gaza has descended into a cascade of catastrophes. And I think that's probably the correct way of trying to explain what's been happening. Now, we all, I'm sure, in this room watch Al Jazeera. We know I don't have to go into the finer details of what's happened since the genocide began in October 2023. But I think because I write briefing documents on Palestine daily, briefing documents, submissions, answers to parliamentary questions, media statements, I'm so bombarded with these things that I'm just going to mention the things to you that I find the most shocking, that I report on often, because it really goes to the heart of what the people of Gaza are experiencing. So, first of all, the official numbers of people killed since the beginning of the genocide is around 68,000. That's the Gaza Ministry of Health, with 170,000 injured. But we all know that there are tens of thousands unaccounted for under the rubble. So it will be many, many more than this. Harvard and other organizations, as I think Haider mentioned in one of the last events, the numbers are far higher. But what I found very interesting is that a former Israeli army general, an army commander, Herzi Halevi, has said that there are over 200,000 Palestinians, Gazans, that have been killed since the beginning of the genocide, 80% of which he admits are civilians. So we know that the numbers are far more than what are the official. And we all know that journalists have been a huge casualty in terms of more than in any other war in contemporary history. We're at today, I checked the latest OCHA figures from the UN, 252 journalists have been killed, and now it's a situation where journalists are not even allowed to enter into Gaza. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone that 92% of homes and 94% of hospitals in Gaza have that Gaza is an area that's 365 square kilometers, and that's about half the size of the city of London. And when you consider that on some area, half the size of London, there's been 200,000 tons of bombs dropped, 200,000 tons of explosive dropped on that area, which is the equivalent of, you could say, 13 Hiroshima-style bombs. It is really hard to believe, with each bomb weighing about 900 kilograms. I don't think any of us could even fathom what does that really mean in practical terms for the people that are living through that bombing, to have that many bombs dropped on that tiny area. And we all know the death, the carnage, the annihilation that those bombs have caused. Very few of us even think about the environmental damage that is caused, how dangerous breathing that air is for the people that actually live there. But it's really industrial scale devastation, unlike I think we've ever seen in our living history. It's also important to note that during that time of those bombs being dropped, $12.3 billion of US direct military aid went to Israel, without which I'm sure that this couldn't have been sustained to the point that it has. And of those people killed, 30%, that everybody agrees with those statistics, 30% at least are children. According to the official statistics, that means 20,000 children have died, and 25,000 missing. But actually, it's probably far in excess of that because of the numbers that we know are not, they're not accurate, because we can't even begin to know all the people that actually are missing. I think the thing that hurts me the most, and I've been saying it every time I've emceed the Day of Solidarity with the Palestinians in November each year since this started, is what I can't fathom is that 5,000 amputations have taken place in the last 2 years, and since the genocide started, and most would have been without anesthetic. And 2,000 of those amputations have been children. I can't even imagine one child going through an amputation without an anesthetic, but 5,000 people to have their limbs cut off without any medicine. It's actually sort of unbelievable. It's like we're living in a very strange dystopia that we can't quite comprehend. Now, many of you will know that the United Nations is supposed to, OCHA specifically, distribute food and humanitarian aid, and we would know that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was established by the Israelis and the Americans to distribute aid and eclipse the role of the UN and the humanitarian organizations, and that many of these sites where the aid was supposed to be distributed by this GHF were then used as targeting sites to kill people that are waiting for aid. And I'm so exhausted to every week report on how many more people were killed than from the last week waiting for aid, trying to access food. So we're now at official figures of 2,613 killed trying to access food aid, almost or more than 20,000 injuries, and that's just since the 27th of May of this year. And then we have the fact that Israel is widely recognized by the United Nations, by various countries around the world, is using starvation as a weapon of war. And I remember being so shocked when I heard that 12 people had died of starvation, and then you feel this, sick feeling that this is just going to get worse. The world can't watch as more people die of starvation, and we're now at 461 people who have died of starvation, 157 of them being children. So this is really the worst types of violations of the Geneva Convention, which said that civilians cannot be harmed in war. And I think the people who have it worst in Gaza are those that live in the north, because that's the area that Israel had wanted to clear of the people. It's where they wanted to basically have settlers move in. Many of them have the blueprints of how they want to rebuild Gaza with settlers on the land. So right now there's 200,000 people left in north of Gaza, and it's inaccessible. You can't communicate with those people. The UN doesn't have access to those people. And what really shows you is that usually, like during the genocide, it's been these kitchens that are producing meals per day for the people to get them some type of food. And in the north of Gaza, with the 200,000 people, they're only managing to make 53,000 meals a day. So that's one meal a day for 53,000 people, but there's 200,000 people that get no access to any kind of humanitarian assistance. So they're literally just starving to death. And I think you have to look at it that way to really realize how bad it is. There was UN bakeries operating until April in the north of Gaza. Since April, there's been no UN bakeries operating whatsoever. And then we have a statement by the Israeli Prime Minister that there's no starvation in Gaza. If there was starvation in Gaza, there wouldn't be any people. And you can just see how problematic this all is. So I'm moving on to the more legalistic part of my talk, but I just wanted to say something personal that 2 weeks ago, there were 3 people who did a speaking tour, largely on Palestine and South Africa. So it was Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader, who is quite excited will launch his new political party next month, and then will face off against the right-wing Nigel Farage in the next 2027 elections. There was also Mustafa Barghouti. You're welcome to come in. Mustafa Barghouti is the leader, for those that don't know, of the Palestine National Initiative, which is a political party in Palestine, and he was also here on a speaking tour. What's interesting about him is that according to the latest poll in Palestine, it puts the popularity for president of Mahmoud Abbas at 17% and the popularity of Mustafa Barghouti at 39%. So it could very well be, all things being equal, that he could become a leader making all the decisions one day in Palestine. But he was on a speaking tour, and there was also Yumna Al-Sayed. Now, some of you may remember that Yumna was that journalist in Al Jazeera who was the face of reporting from Gaza. She would always wear a helmet. And you probably remember this clip played over and over where there was a building bombed behind her and she sort of cried out and ducked and dove. That's Yumna. And Yumna has not been seen much anymore on Al Jazeera. And what she explained in an event in Lodium 2 weekends ago is she had, and I attended this, and I'm telling you this story because for all the statistics that I just gave you about how bad things are in Gaza, this is the thing that killed me inside, more than anything else. She said I had to choose between being a mother and a journalist for Al Jazeera. And I have 4 little girls. And we had an apartment in Gaza with my husband. All 6 of us would be sleeping in a bed. And my little girls would cry at night that they want us to be closer and closer together in the bed. There mustn't be any spaces left between us. And when they would ask them why, she would say, that the children would say, because if a missile strikes us, we don't want one of us to remain alive, we must all die together. And these are small children. And I think that more than anything, that really cut deep inside of me. I went and spoke to her afterwards. I asked her, what is she doing now? She said she managed to get her whole family into Egypt. And from Egypt, she's going to be writing for British newspapers, which doesn't pay very well. We're hoping that maybe she comes here, by the way, to do a master's and a PhD. So there's been some discussions about that, which I had hoped to organize. But that type of story just shows you how desperate it is. And it's a miracle, actually, that she survived all the reporting that she was doing. So I thought I would share with you that personal anecdote. But all of us in the room know that what is happening in Palestine, it's not just a humanitarian crisis. It's a political crisis. I'm sure we all would agree. And that crisis needs international solidarity. Internationalism is not just a luxury for the oppressed in Palestine or anywhere else in the world, Western Sahara, or wherever else. It's a necessity. So if we look back at the struggle in South Africa, it is on the success and victory in South Africa also was on the shoulders of the Cuban brigades. It was on the shoulders of Swedish trade unionists, intellectuals from India and the Caribbean, and a host of different civil society forces around the world. If we didn't have that pillar of our struggle, we wouldn't maybe have had freedom at the time that we did. And so we need to remember, as we're looking forward and projecting forward in terms of Gaza, that international solidarity is absolutely key in this situation. Our President, Cyril Ramaphosa, said to the UN General Assembly that the reason South Africa took the action that it did at the International Court of Justice was an attempt to ensure that the same global solidarity that was given to South Africa under apartheid and helped to end apartheid would also be mobilized to end the apartheid that the Palestinians are experiencing and what is happening in Gaza. So that's why we took our case to the ICJ. We also recognize that all states, all member states of the UN have an obligation to prevent genocide. That's a binding obligation on all states. So South Africa, I am very proud to work with the South African government. It doesn't mean that we do everything right all the time. But the fact that we had the moral fortitude to take this case to the ICJ, and we are prepared, despite all the pressure, to see it through to its finality, I think is something that we can all be proud of. It's the only reason I can think maybe we don't have hundreds of thousands of people in the streets as they do in Turkey and London and Australia, because we know that our government is trying to do something. But also we should also make our voices heard on the streets as well. But just to give you a quick recap of how the ICJ process unfolded, I remember first hearing about this in December 2023, 2.5 months into the genocide, that we were filing a case at the ICJ. And on the 26th of January 2024, the court delivered its ruling on South Africa's request for provisional measures. Now, unfortunately, at that time, they didn't say that military operations must be suspended. Not that that would have ever been adhered to, because we know nothing has been adhered to date. But they did say that there must be the protection of civilians, and civilians must get humanitarian aid. And South Africa approached the ICJ a number of times for provisional measures because things just kept getting worse and worse. On the 24th of May, the ICJ made another ruling on South Africa's request for provisional measures. And it ordered Israel to prevent acts of genocide, protect civilians, provide humanitarian aid, and to immediately end its offensive in Rafah. We had given a lot of evidence about this. And then South Africa tried again in October. So that was December 23, January 24, May 24, and now we're at October 2024. South Africa's team worked round the clock, and they put together over 700 pages of evidence of a case that proves that this is genocide, and an accompanying 4,000 pages of forensic evidence. If we don't recognize that as being a real effort, I think it may not have saved people in the interim, which is what I struggle with every day, but I think that was quite a significant effort to have done that. And there are a number of, we've always been encouraging countries to sign on and to intervene in our case, to join our case at the ICJ. Just for those who are interested, this is the list of countries that has joined our case. And really, sadly, it's only about 13 or 14, so a lot of countries could actually now still decide that they can join our case. But the ones that have is Bolivia, Chile, Maldives, Spain, Belgium, Ireland, Nicaragua, Colombia, Mexico, Turkey, Cuba, Libya, and Palestine, and Egypt. Those are the ones that have said that they would join our case. And interestingly, many of them have a history also of fighting imperialism and colonialism. Now the problem is Israel's disregard for the rulings of the ICJ have obviously undermined the integrity of the court. It harms all the institutions of global governance that want to try and end impunity in international relations. And really, we all will accept that we cannot pick and choose which binding orders of the ICJ are going to be adhered to and which ones should be ignored. So what happened, and I think I want to just recap, because this is very important in understanding a timeline. So the UN General Assembly, and that was last year, they requested an advisory opinion from the ICJ on the legality of Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, the ICJ gave that advisory opinion in July 2024, so just over a year ago, where the ICJ found, and this is separate now from the case that I'm mentioning, this is on the illegality of their presence in the occupied territories. They found the presence to be unlawful. And because they made that finding, that their onus was on the UN member states to have a collective response to ensure that that legal decision taken by the apex court in the world would be respected and implemented. So what the UN member states did, they all signed, well, there was a vast majority of them, passed a resolution in the UN General Assembly. Now this is in September 2024, it's about a year ago, and they confirmed the ICJ's advisory opinion demanding that Israel must comply within a year. That deadline passed a month ago. That deadline to comply was by September 2025, which obviously they failed to do. And in that resolution, it's very important to read the wording, because the wording of this UN resolution that was approved by most of the states was not to render aid or assist in maintaining the illegal situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territories. There was also a call not to transfer weapons, parts, ammunition to the parties to the conflict, which end up committing violations of international humanitarian law and enable the violence and killing of civilians. So that was an important process that shows that it has been made very clear by member states that what is happening is unacceptable and we cannot support it. The question is how much are the states and governments going to adhere? The other thing that I think we should note is, what does it mean, obligations of third-party states? So in international law, there's something called an obligation of third-party states, which means all states, not to condone wrongful acts of other states and to prevent genocide. That is an obligation on all countries. So what does that mean? It means that no state can be above the law and no people beneath the law's protection. And that is a very important concept. And part of those obligations mean that we as a country, and all countries, have a duty not to aid or abet any serious violations. And we have an obligation when we see them happening to act against it. If we don't do that, we are in violation of the Genocide Convention. So when we see that there's a selective enforcement of international law, that is what is now caused, this is the title of what I'm talking about today, is a new paradigm shift globally. We've seen all these things that I've outlined to you today, and we've seen no action. Just impunity. It just gets worse all the time, and Israel's not being held to account, and no one seems to be able to get it to stop what it's doing. So what have we seen? And I think this is a very positive part of the story, is because the global South, which means a lot of the progressive countries of the South, have come together and realized that they have to take the lead, they have to champion the need to enforce international law and to call for international justice, and that will require coordinated action. And that is why in January of this year, South Africa and Colombia co-chaired the establishment, under the auspices of an NGO called Progressive International, of something called the Hague Group, which some of you may not know about it, but it was established in January of this year. And it's a platform for coordinated state action to enforce international law, to hold all states accountable for breaches of international law, and to protect ultimately the integrity of our international legal system. If you're not going to have any integrity in the legal system, who's ever going to? There will be really no rule of law internationally as we move forward. So the Hague Group countries, many of them, interestingly, are states that also really push for the right to self-determination, whether it's Palestine or others. They have always believed in an end to colonialism and the consistency in applying of values in the international system. So there were 8 countries that started the Hague Group. And just so that you know who they are, they're South Africa and Colombia, they're co-chaired, and it's Bolivia, Cuba, Honduras, Senegal, Namibia, and Malaysia. So they called for collective action through coordinated legal and diplomatic measures at the national and international levels to hold Israel accountable. So I analyze this as being a really important shift from just solidarity to enforceable legal procedures. And what did the Hague Group in January this year call for? I want to tell you how it changed, because there were 3 meetings, one in January, one in July, and one in September. And they seem to have become more coordinated and more organized as we go along. So at the beginning, it was rather vague, but they said we must halt arms transfers to Israel, we must block weapons shipments, we must suspend procurement from Israeli firms, and we must cease energy exports. Then we had the second meeting in July. That was held in Bogota, Colombia, and so instead of just being the 8 states, it's now 30 states. And those 30 states included some of the big names like China, Ireland, Qatar, Oman, Brazil, Pakistan. Those are some of the states that now joined in those 30 states. Only 12 of them signed the declaration, but the declaration was really important. And countries can continue to join as signatories. So that is number one, not to supply and transport arms, fuel, or equipment to the Israeli Defense Force, to review government contracts, and that's to prevent public funds from supporting the illegal occupation, and thirdly, to prevent vessels carrying supplies from using the ports of those countries. So that was very important. And then we had the third meeting, which was on the margins of the UN General Assembly last month in September. That meeting came 1 year after this UN General Assembly's deadline to Israel to stop what it's doing. And that was a high-level meeting called to halt the genocide. So we're hoping that this will gain more and more momentum. And all of us as countries that have signed onto the Hague Group need to ensure that we do those things. And that is a process because we have to tap into our own domestic legislation. We have to pass legislation probably to actually ensure that we do these things, that we actually do what we've signed on to do. So I also want to mention that at this time that we're going through these phases this year, it's also interesting that there's been a consensus developed around the narrative that it is genocide, and that's also really important. It's something we report on all the time. So in September of this year, there was the Independent International Commission of Inquiry into the Occupied Palestinian Territories, which Navi Pillay, who's South African, was steering. And they came out with their report that said Israel's actions constitute genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and that they had a genocidal intent. That was very important, and we knew that that was going to be their finding. There's also Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which have also come out and said that it is genocide. And very importantly, some Israeli human rights NGOs have said the same, like B'Tselem. B'Tselem has been a long-standing Israeli human rights organization, and they have been very specific in saying there's been a deliberate action to destroy Palestinian society. And there's a clear and present danger beyond even Gaza. There's a clear and present danger in the West Bank as well. We are moving from oppression to annihilation, is what their report said, and that all of us, it requires the use of every means available under law, under international law, to stop what is happening. There was also Physicians for Human Rights who put out that it is genocide, that there's the deliberate destruction of healthcare that is critical for the survival of the people of Gaza, and there's been massive restrictions on medical evacuations, as we know. So this is now a coalescence of forces saying the same thing, both from within Israel itself and in the broader community, that basically back up South Africa's case at the ICJ. So what I found last month, is that what happened at the UN General Assembly was in many ways a strategic inflection point. Because there we have Netanyahu get up to speak, and many of us will have seen. There was a mass walkout of people from the chamber of the General Assembly who were not prepared to listen to what he had to say, and he, when he did speak, vowed to finish the job. So there's no feeling that they had done anything wrong, obviously. And then what we had around the same time as the big General Assembly meeting was a raft of recognitions of Palestine as a state. Now, yes, that is largely symbolic, but it's very important because it shows a shift in the diplomatic posture of member states. So on the 22nd of September, there were 12 countries that include UK and France as permanent members of the UN Security Council that had said that they will recognize Palestine as a state. That brings the number of recognitions to a total of 157, which is very important. Some of these recognitions are conditional and tied to governance reforms, etc. And maybe it doesn't make any difference to what's happening on the ground, but it is important politically at a political level. What we will say about it, though, is that these actions must be accompanied by instruments, milestones, and timelines that will produce the political end state for Palestine. So they have to have credible enforcement levers and consequences, but what it could be, and this is what we'd like to see it as a catalyst towards peace negotiations, if that's even possible. Although it's looking fairly grim when we hear the current Prime Minister Netanyahu saying there will be no Palestinian state under his leadership. So that's a bit worrying. Okay, now I would like to talk about what's happening in Israel, because that's also important if we're analyzing where are we going from here. We have had this Gaza Peace Plan, but what does it mean in terms of are Israelis thinking within the Knesset, their parliament, and also their civil society? What is it in their minds that is the end game? I've read some polls that say that 79% of Israelis think that their government has done the right thing. So I suppose with the censorship within Israel, that their mind shift is not what the international mindset has been on Gaza. Maybe they haven't had access to Al Jazeera, or they refuse to watch it, I'm not sure. But in the Knesset in July this year, the Israeli parliament passed a resolution, very important, in support of Israel's sovereignty over the West Bank. And you have to understand that they want Gaza, but the West Bank is the final prize, because they consider the West Bank Judea and Samaria. And in the preamble to this Knesset resolution, it said that I'll just quote, it said Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley are an inseparable part of the land of Israel, historical, cultural, and spiritual homeland of the Jewish people. It then went on to say that sovereignty for Israel in Judea and Samaria is an integral part of fulfilling Zionism and a national vision of Jewish people returning to their ancestral homeland. So I think when you hear that that is something that was overwhelmingly passed in the Israeli parliament, it doesn't give one much hope that they're going to put any kind of pressure for a real peace negotiations. And the problem with this resolution also, in reality, is that it empowers those that are controlling the planning, the land registration, the settlement authorization, the road projects, the municipal integration. So what is this? This is bureaucratic absorption, which is the strategic path to territorial change. And that's basically, in essence, the land grab will continue at an incredible rate, I think. So this is de facto annexation by administrative means. And since I've been to Palestine in 2001, I remember Ehud Olmert. He was the mayor of Jerusalem at the time. And he used this whole thing of, he would gerrymander the borders and the way that the system, even the sewage system and the water system, would work in Jerusalem to make sure that Jerusalem could never be divided, that East Jerusalem could never be the capital of Palestine. Even at that time, they were using this means of a bureaucratic absorption to ensure that there could never be the Palestinian state that the UN has called for along the 1967 borders. And what Israel has continued to do since July, since this resolution, is to put pressure on Palestinian communities through punitive demolitions, movement control, military incursions. I mean, we could go on and on about what's happened in the West Bank. It hasn't been the same type of genocide that we've seen in Gaza, but there are so many checkpoints you can hardly move in the West Bank. It's just choking. I forget how many, Heidi might know how many, but there's a lot of checkpoints that people have to go through. So this, again, is a shift. This is moving beyond incremental settlement expansion to formalizing Israeli sovereignty in their parliament. And that's a repudiation of all the major UN resolutions. There have been many of them, but the one most important is Resolution 242, 338, 2334, and the ICJ advisory opinion. And also, we mustn't forget that the settlements violate Article 49 of the Geneva Convention that outlaws settlements on conquered territory. So all of that is illegal. The West Bank now has 450,000 settlers versus 1,200 in 1972. In East Jerusalem, which is supposed to be Palestinian territory, there's 220,000 settlers as opposed to 8,650 in 1972. So we can see that this whole settlement project is really all about a land grab and creating facts on the ground. It's aggressive land theft that is altering the demographic map. So what we've seen in Gaza is a culmination of all of these things that I've talked about. And we can see what has been happening in the last few weeks. It's obliteration, it's a scorched earth campaign. Gaza City, which now they believe that they have said to Israelis that they will move 1 million people out of Gaza City. And they're using, as many of us would know, artificial intelligence to run the war, targeting people that doesn't even have human beings who oversee it. It's all done by computers. And that's what's devastating is even with this new Gaza peace plan, we are still seeing attacks carrying on. I also thought it was quite interesting that last month, Netanyahu was at a ceremony marking the expansion of what is known as the E1 settlement block. And what he said at that opening ceremony was, we are going to fulfill our promise that there will be no Palestinian state because this place belongs to us. So I'm not very optimistic that despite all of Trump's, what he's been saying and announcing this week will really hold much water, because the same leadership exists in Israel that has a plan, that they're intent on carrying it out. So what is this Gaza 21-point peace plan? What it is a 60-day ceasefire where they will hand over the hostages. Israel will withdraw to a buffer zone along the border with Egypt. But what we already know is there's a place called the Philadelphia Corridor, which is the land between Rafah and the Sinai. And Israel has already said that it's not going to leave the Philadelphia Corridor. Also, the significant aid is supposed to be being brought in now from today by the United Nations, by the Palestinian Red Cross. The initial agreement, which the Arab countries had supported, and then many things changed between the two agreements, was that there was going to be 600 trucks a day, which is what the UN says is the minimum necessary to sustain human life. Now that wording was changed. So in the final agreement, they took out 600 trucks a day and they quote unquote put full support, whatever that's supposed to mean. So we don't think that they're ever going to adhere to enough aid getting in to help people to survive and recover from starvation. There's also in this 2-month period supposed to be negotiations for a permanent ceasefire. We'll see whether that ever transpires. There's obviously supposed to be a halt to military operations, and overnight we can see that more Palestinians were killed in the last day. And very importantly, probably most importantly, there's supposed to be a post-war Gaza governance framework. And that is supposed to have been done in consultation with the Palestinians. Israel and the US would like to see Hamas excluded. For me, the horrifying thing, which I know that Jeremy Corbyn mentioned at length on his speaking tour in South Africa, is how can the suggestion ever have been made that Tony Blair, who has so little credibility after the Iraq War, would be made a governor or a mayor of Gaza? And in what world would that ever be acceptable to anyone? But the whole way they've treated the post-Gaza governance framework as being one of trusteeship, of custodianship, where it's like a fig leaf for occupation, where the Palestinians have no real rights, they have no real say, they're not even invited to the discussions about it, no consultation, which means that they have no agency in the process, and it's just an ultimatum. And really they're being treated as subjects. If this is a neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism, then I don't know what is. In the agreement, there's also something called the need for an international stabilization force. Now, I was reading someone's memoirs who they had been in Egypt in 1954, and they had written about what had happened in 1967 because they lived through that period. And they said what was very interesting in May 1967 is that the UN had forces on the ground in Gaza. The minute that the UN withdrew those forces in May 1967, in June the Israelis took over Gaza. So that international stabilization force is actually quite significant and important. But at the same time, many analysts say that Israel will determine the areas which it deems terror-free and then allow perhaps a stabilization force there, but it will all be on Israel's terms. Also part of the agreement is it's all conditional on disarmament of Hamas and Palestinian Authority reform. I don't see disarmament. I don't see that Hamas went through all of this to disarm at the end of the day. They may have agreed to it. I'm not sure that it will ever happen. And what's also very problematic about this agreement is it talks about self-determination of the Palestinians as an aspiration. It doesn't say that it's their right, and it is their right. It also, what we really need to see for a Palestinian state is that Gaza and the West Bank are joined, that it's a contiguous area of land, and this does not provide for that at all. And it it's obvious that the settlement construction will continue. So in general, I personally see this as not so much a roadmap to peace, but the political theater of dispossession. So in closing, I'd just like to talk what I think we need in the future. What we need for Palestine is an end to the military occupation in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We need an end to the apartheid system of discrimination. There has to be the exercise of self-determination for the Palestinians so that they have agency in determining their own future. And we need, at the end of the day, something I've been writing about even as a foreign editor and even before that in NGOs since 2001. We need an independent, sovereign, and viable Palestinian state. The first time when I went to Palestine in 2001, they were talking about if there's a two-state solution, Palestine cannot have its own military to defend itself. It won't have control over its own borders. They won't be able to have their own foreign policy. They won't control their own waters off of Gaza. They won't be allowed an airport. Now, that was in the Oslo process. That's why Yasser Arafat said, had I agreed to Oslo, they would have been dancing on my grave, because that is not a viable Palestinian state. So if there was going to be two states, there needs to be a viable state. Maybe we should just be talking about Palestinian statehood, because that is what we really want to see. We also can't forget about the need for the right of refugees to return that were displaced in 1948 and 1967. So what have we already seen in this week since it was announced that there's a Gaza peace plan, since it was all signed onto? There's already been violations of the ceasefire. They've said that they will not open Rafah crossing today. They're limiting the humanitarian supplies that are being allowed into Gaza. They're continuing to kill people in Gaza City even yesterday. Settlement expansion and design continues. And it's not only, I should say, because I'm in charge of the Levant, which is broader than just Palestine, is that the bombing, there was a peace agreement with Lebanon, between Israel and Lebanon this year. And they have continued to bomb Lebanon. I continue to write analysis every week on the bombings that happen in Lebanon, that Israel is bombing them. That peace agreement didn't lead to that, complete peace, and it just lost traction in the global media. But Israel is still continuing to bomb Lebanon. In Syria, since the HTS took power in December last year, it just took a few months for Israel to basically have a blank check to destroy, I believe it's 85 or 95% of Syria's military capabilities has been destroyed through Israeli bombing, and Israel continues to bomb Syria. And they even have the wherewithal to say that no Syrian defense force can position itself south of Damascus, and if they do, we will bomb them because that is our new buffer zone. I can't imagine any country saying any South African National Defense Force that positions itself south of Pretoria will be bombed because it's some other country's buffer zone, if we can just think of it like that. So I think we're really looking at a very long struggle. It may be a struggle that we never see the end of in our lifetime, but I think for us it's important to understand the timelines, what has happened, what we're looking at, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing my colleague Haider Eid's, what his views and perspectives are on the way forward and what needs to be done. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Haider, over to you.